Welcome back to Relevant History, and today we're trying out something new here in the channel. That's right, we're taking a look at Hamilton, an American musical. Created by Lin-Manuel Miranda, the musical uses rap, hip-hop, and pop to tell the life story of founding father Alexander Hamilton. For those of you who aren't familiar with US history or just need to refresh your memory, Alexander Hamilton is an influential figure when it comes to talking about the American Revolution, the War of Independence, the ratification of the US Constitution, and even establishing the country's financial system, just to name a few achievements. Also, I believe his name in Spanish would translate to Alejandro Jamonito. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yep, see, no need to look it up. Thanks to a grant for history students back when I was in high school, I got to watch it for free. And now that Hamilton was added to Disney Plus because of 4th of July, I decided to give it a rewatch and do some personal research so I could point out those historical accuracies, minor inaccuracies, and big inaccuracies that stood out for me. Now, I'm not going to be running around pointing out my finger saying, actually, no. I understand that above all, a musical is a piece of art and entertainment. So I'm also going to be explaining why I think those inaccuracies were not corrected, and if possible, how could they have been fixed without hurting the musical's artistic value. Okay, enough rambling. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Hamilton. I hope you learn and you also enjoy. The musical starts by giving us background information about Hamilton's life, which, if you ask me, it's pretty accurate. Born in Nevis in 1755 or 1757, Hamilton did in fact suffer various misfortunes before getting to New York in 1772. Also, I like the depiction of Hamilton's personality. He was very young when he got involved in the American Revolution, so he was very active and passionate in what he did. This includes his non-stop reading and writing, which is constantly mentioned throughout the musical. Another neat detail that is referenced is how Hamilton avoided talking about his past, a scene when Angelica asked him about his parents and he just avoided the question. Continuing with Hamilton's life, I really like how the musical mentions Hamilton's many accomplishments. Before the musical, Hamilton's two best-known achievements were that he was the first Secretary of the Treasury and that he founded the first National Bank of the United States. But the musical goes above and beyond by reminding the audience of Hamilton's less known achievements. These include being Washington's right-hand man during the war, participating in the first murder trial in US history, attending the Constitutional Convention, writing 51 out of the 85 Federalist Papers that persuaded the adoption of the Constitution, creating the New York Post, founding the Federalist Party, and even establishing the US Coast Guard. You can't make this up, the man did a lot. There's a few minor accomplishments also mentioned, like how he and his volunteer unit stole British cannons in 1775. He also managed to marry Eliza Schuyler in 1780, despite not being rich. And he also was a commander during the Battle of Yorktown. Speaking of Yorktown, would you look at that, here's the first inaccuracy that I'll have to point out. The musical depicts Hamilton being fired by Washington for helping Lawrence duel Charles Lee. In reality though, Hamilton actually quit the post over a much insignificant reason. I can see why Lin-Manuel Miranda changed this, and I don't blame him, so I'll mark this as a minor inaccuracy. The next minor inaccuracy you'll run into involves the way Hamilton met Aaron Burr, James Lawrence, Hercules Mulligan, and the Marquis de Lafayette. In reality, Hamilton got to meet these people personally after the war began, but the way they are introduced in the musical makes sense. There's a lot of time constraints, and the characters play a big role in the first act, so it's wise to introduce them as quickly as possible and in a group. The only character meetup or meetups that I unfortunately have to mark as a major inaccuracy, however, are the interactions between Burr and Hamilton. The truth is that most of these encounters are completely fictionalized. For example, Burr was not present during the duel between Charles Lee and Lawrence. Now, why were all these encounters with Burr made up? Well, the fact that we know Burr shot Hamilton means his presence foreshadows the buildup of tensions, which will end up in the infamous duel. It creates a really good plot structure, and honestly, the only alternative I can imagine is to depict Burr as a friendly side character who unexpectedly turns against Hamilton towards the end of the musical. But there's obviously a big problem with that. You would need to basically restructure the entire plot of the musical, and so no matter how much this screams inaccuracy, there's not much that you can do to change it, so we'll just let it be. Here's another reason why I think that inaccuracy should be left untouched. Thanks to this plot structure, we actually get a nice representation of the real Aaron Burr. As the musical tells us, Burr did in fact become an orphan at a young age. I also like the reference to his religious grandfather, who was none other than Jonathan Edwards. He was a Christian theologian best known for his role in the First Great Awakening. It's also true that Burr had an affair with Theodosia, the wife of a British officer. You know, they actually ended up marrying after the husband died during the war, and had a daughter named Theodosia, as mentioned in one of the songs. When it comes to Burr's personality, I would say he's nicely depicted. For example, Burr sings how in any situation he's willing to quote-unquote wait for it. The man used to carefully look for the right opportunity and could easily make connections with anyone, no matter the side or political belief. This is perfectly summarized when he advises Hamilton by saying to quote-unquote, don't let them know what you're against or what you're for. As a quick side note, I almost forgot about this, but I wanted to add how Burr's legacy as a villain is accurately depicted here because he's pretty much best known for two things: his duel with Hamilton and the Burr conspiracy. Look it up. When it comes to other characters, they all seem okay for me except for a minor inaccuracy that I found in Marquis de Lafayette. In the song My Shot, Lafayette sings how he dreams of a democratic revolution in France that would get rid of the king. In reality though, Lafayette actually wanted a constitutional monarchy and was definitely not a big fan of beheading the king when that whole fiasco happened. At the end of the day though, this musical is about the American Revolution and not the French Revolution, so this inaccuracy is more of a pet peeve for me more than anything. So I'll just count it as a minor inaccuracy. Now when it comes to Lawrence, I actually think his presentation was more factual than Lafayette's. Lawrence was indeed a big critic of slavery, which is the reason why he and Hamilton became close friends. I would even say he was more anti-slavery than Hamilton himself. He did try to create an all-black regiment which would have granted slaves their freedom, but Southern opposition and his death in 1775 prevented it. As a bonus fact though, many black soldiers actually did fight in the war, and in both the American and British sides. Since I talked about Lawrence and Lafayette, now I'm forced to address some sensitive inaccuracies. The first one is a big inaccuracy on Hamilton's views towards slavery. First of all, Hamilton was without a doubt anti-slavery, but the lack of writing against slavery in the later parts of his life are evidence that he chose to do very little about it in the public sphere. The reasons behind his decline in anti-slavery activities may include marrying into the slaveholding Schuyler family, Lawrence's death, and for political gain. This means Hamilton supported manumission, or allowing owners to free their slaves if they wanted to, rather than abolition, which is when the government banned slavery. That's actually the reason why he joined the New York Manumission Society. Now it seems like Hamilton practiced anti-slavery in his personal life by not owning slaves, but even then there's evidence that's still being debated suggesting he might have briefly owned slaves. As you can see, in reality, Hamilton's views on slavery were complicated. I actually understand Lin-Manuel Miranda's decision to avoid this complexity in order to speed up the story. I mean, geez, just look at the musical's length already. But slavery is a very important topic in American history, so I can't just ignore what's been left out here. A few important facts are left out when it comes to Hamilton's views on immigration.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Yeah, I can't. I have to say it. That is 100% true, and I am proof of that. When it comes to Hamilton the immigrant, he technically wasn't an immigrant because Nevis was a British colony. But number one, citizenship as we know it today wasn't really a thing back then. And two, coming from the Caribbean, Hamilton did feel like an outsider. Immigrants can actually relate to him because basically he had to earn his spot as an American by working hard. But here's the catch. Hamilton actually supported anti-immigration policies such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, and there's even evidence that suggests he only favored immigration from British background people. Ouch. Nevertheless, I'm only making this a minor inaccuracy, and I would actually strongly oppose removing it, because not only does it obviously put immigrants in the good light that they're supposed to be, but it reminds the audience that the US is in fact made up of immigrants, including the British. Moving on with another minor inaccuracy, we have the simplification of real-life dueling. I'm not going to get too much into this one, I just want to point out that the duels in the musical are depicted differently compared to witness reports, and that there are more than 10 quote-unquote duel commandments. If you're interested in the 25 real rules of dueling, I recommend you check out the Code Duello. I completely understand the decision of cutting down the rules to 10. There are too many and too detailed for both Miranda to include and for the general audience to care, so let's move on. Now, instead of talking of the duels themselves, I want to focus on the real reason why Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. After losing the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson thanks to Hamilton, Burr actually did in fact become vice president, but Jefferson didn't trust Burr for obvious reasons, and so he wanted to get rid of him in the next election. Fortunately for Jefferson, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, and would you look at that, second place is no longer a vice president. So when the 1804 election arrived, Burr didn't even try running. He knew Jefferson and his party would not support him, so he instead campaigned to become governor of New York. But Burr lost in a landslide, and guess who helped his opponent win? Yup, Alexander Hamilton. You all saw how mad he was when he lost the election of 1800. Imagine how he felt when he lost in 1804. I honestly think the story with Burr running for governor would have worked in the musical too. But once again, it's probably best to not make the musical over 3 hours long. Here's another inaccuracy that I initially marked as red, but I decided to leave it as yellow. When it comes to the end of Hamilton's political career, the musical tells us that Hamilton was fired by John Adams after he became president. To ensure Hamilton wouldn't make a comeback, Jefferson, Madison, and Burr came up to Hamilton and accused him of stealing government funds. Hamilton is forced to talk about the affair with Maria Reynolds to prove he did not steal any money, and soon after he has to publish the Reynolds pamphlet to out himself rather than have his political enemies expose him. But in reality, the order of these events was completely different. You see, Hamilton actually quit his job in 1794, 2 years before Adams was even elected. 3 years later, then you get the whole Reynolds pamphlet scandal. And also, just as a side note, it was actually 3 other politicians who approached Hamilton and discovered the scandal, one of them being future US President James Monroe. Anyways, as bad as the Reynolds scandal was for Hamilton, that alone was not enough to destroy his political career. What made Hamilton hit rock bottom was the publishing of a letter criticizing John Adams. That letter is mentioned in the song The Adams Administration, but it actually was leaked during the election of 1800 by Hamilton's enemies. Crazy, right? I think the reason for changing the order of events was to achieve a more linear story and better dramatic build-up, and I don't blame Miranda for doing so. I think by now you understand that Hamilton's political career was too messy to accurately depict it in less than 3 hours, so I don't see any viable alternative to what Miranda did. Oh, speaking of a political mess, here's another big critique of Hamilton. It takes the founding fathers and makes them look like villains. Unfortunately, I have to agree with historians on this one because you can't devalue the tremendous amount of work Jefferson and Madison undertook to create the US just because they didn't like Hamilton. Believe me though, Jefferson has done way worse things than roasting Hamilton in a rap battle.
Stay mellow, doing whatever the hell it is you do in Monticello.
Despite the obvious pro-Hamilton bias, I'm against changing it because first of all, this isn't an academic textbook. The musical focuses on Hamilton's life, so it makes sense that the narrative's viewpoint favors him. Second, I love how antagonizing Jefferson and Madison makes people realize that after independence, the founding fathers basically hated each other. Seriously, they smeared each other in the press, and sometimes friendships broke down for years. Just look at what happened between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. What can I say? Politics is a messy job, but let's move on. Here's a claim that's central to the theme of Hamilton. The beginning and the end of the musical mentions Hamilton being quote-unquote forgotten, which is a debatable claim. I'm sure you can make an academic essay backing this up, so that's why I'm giving it a green marking. Now, with me being part of the history world, I personally don't 100% agree with this claim. Hamilton is mentioned in American history textbooks and historians are well aware of what he did and what his views were. I do think, however, that Hamilton has been underrated or sidelined sometimes compared to other founding fathers. Now, when it comes to the general public and general knowledge, I am more inclined to agree with this statement. I mean, from my personal experience, when the term founding fathers is mentioned, most people think of Washington, Jefferson, Adams, but they usually forget about Hamilton and John Jay. Also, am I the only one who runs into people who can't remember who's in the $10 bill? Now, what I like about the forgotten Hamilton claim, even if I don't completely agree with it, is that it brings up the fact that Eliza Hamilton played a huge role in preserving her husband's memory. The mention of Eliza collecting sources for Hamilton's biography, fundraising the Washington Monument, continuing to have anti-slavery views, and the orphanage she founded are real things Eliza did. And it's a shame that Hamilton's life is sometimes ignored because by doing so, people ignore what I believe to be the best example of how the founding mothers helped their husbands push along the foundation of the US. Okay, I just realized we're about to hit the two biggest inaccuracies in the musical. The problem is that it has become harder to talk about these because people have labeled them as controversial. But before we hit that swamp, let's first address two more accuracies that are worth appreciating. First of all, there are a lot of good references to the events leading up to the revolution and the war itself. For example, the dispute between Hamilton and this guy, Samuel Seabury, did happen through a series of open letters between 1774 and 1775. It's a nice detail that acknowledges the colonists who opposed the revolution. And hey, what better way to depict the British than to have King George III reference the Boston Tea Party? When it comes to the war, the names of various important generals are also mentioned. The musical doesn't hesitate to mention Washington's war situation either. It gives you a basic idea of the American war strategy too. Engage in borderline guerrilla warfare until Britain goes bankrupt and the French finally step in to help. Spoiler alert, it worked. The last green mark this musical gets is for putting all those minor yet clever historical facts. In his last song, King George III mentions how he met the now elected John Adams back in 1785. This is because that year, John Adams was appointed the first ambassador to Great Britain. I find the story of John Adams meeting King George so interesting because I can barely imagine how awkward it must have been for poor John Adams. He was really involved in the revolution, and now he had to meet face to face with the king he revolted against. Jeez, look at how awkward they both look. Oh, I can't even imagine how John Adams feels. Another cool detail, in case you missed it, was how James Madison was always coughing and holding a cloth. Most people don't know this, but that's because the real Madison suffered a variety of illnesses throughout his life. You also have all the Federalist versus Democratic Republican animosity, as seen in the cabinet rap battles. It's honestly a clever way to teach people how historically important political policies were debated, like the centralized banking or foreign relations. But one of my favorite historically accurate details was how they managed to put real quotes from Washington's farewell address and Hamilton's last letter to Eliza. It's great, enough to make a grown historian cry. Okay, the time has come. Let's get into the red inaccuracies that are the eye of the hurricane, if you know what I mean. Even though the musical does a good job at presenting the Hamilton-Reynolds affair, it makes the common mistake of mischaracterizing Hamilton for the scandal. After Hamilton's death, historians continued to sensationalize the scandal, and unfortunately, Miranda has done so too, although I think it was mostly unintentional. First is the song A Winter's Ball, where Burr claims Martha Washington's tomcat was named after Hamilton.
That's true.
Yeah, that is completely false. I would have ignored the line had it not been for the use of the word tomcat, a derogatory word for womanizer. What's funny is the story of people labeling Hamilton a tomcat was disproven years ago. Tomcat as a derogatory word did not exist during Hamilton's time, even after the only real-life affair he had. But that's not all. The musical depicts Angelica falling in love with Hamilton, even though by 1800, the real-life Angelica was already married, had children, and was basically on her way to Europe. Miranda confirmed he did so to add more drama to the story, so he unintentionally reinforced an old rumor about a possible Angelica Hamilton affair. Once again, this was a baseless rumor mostly pushed by Hamilton's political enemies. But what about the misplaced comma? Nah. Even BuzzFeed debunked that one, so sit down. Lastly, I already mentioned how the Reynolds pamphlet didn't end Hamilton's political career. I don't want you to think that I belittle the real-life affair Hamilton had. If anything, I'm glad that they didn't ignore it in the musical. But I don't think that it's fair to add more dirt to Hamilton's name than he already deserves for the mistake he made. Especially when he already paid for it centuries ago. These sort of things make you wonder. If Hamilton gets so many extra rumors on him being an adulterer, why do people ignore what Thomas Jefferson did with Sally Hemings? This is a very complex issue that I can't fully explain here, so let's just move on. Oh boy, it's the non-white cast debate. Look, from a historically factual point of view, yes, this is a big inaccuracy. In real life, all the characters were white. Now, from a theatrical viewpoint, I'm okay with casting both white and non-white actors as long as they represent and act out their characters skillfully. Which, come on, they clearly do. Just imagine if Eminem or Logic decided to audition for the role of Aaron Burr and they had the best performance of them all. Do you think Lin-Manuel Miranda would have turned a blind eye to this talent just because they're white? Of course not. And also because it's illegal to deny hiring someone because of their race. The point I'm trying to make is that I trust Miranda's casting choice. He found the best he could find, and the public enjoyed it. I wish that was the end of it, but unfortunately the next inaccuracy relates to the last one. Academic historians have criticized Hamilton for idealizing, simplifying, and sugarcoating history. This is honestly a valid historical critique. For example, Hercules Mulligan was played by an African American, but if you look into the history of the real Hercules Mulligan, you'll discover that he actually owned a slave named Cato, who was equally instrumental in Mulligan's spying. Ironically, he's usually overlooked because any information about Cato after the war was lost. Sounds outrageous, right? Yet some argue that Cato being left out doesn't feel outrageous in the musical because it was sugarcoated by portraying the white slave owner as an African American. Yeah, I'm not sure how to address this argument, but honestly all I can say is please, cut the musical some slack. Miranda had to limit the presentation time, create a well-structured plot, and of course add the singing. So unless this were a multi-season TV series or a large project, you shouldn't expect an encyclopedia on Hamilton. Some simplification and idealization must occur because you have to make the history engaging for the general audience. Now, if you want to get more into the reason behind certain changes, I recommend you check out Hamilton, The Revolution. It's a backstage book explaining the making of Hamilton, and it probably would have made my research 10 times easier. I couldn't get my hands on it, but hey, you gotta work with what you have. In my opinion, if this slightly idealized musical interested people so much that they were willing to go out of their way to learn about the real Hamilton, then the simplification is justified. Oh, would you look at that, we're almost done. The last inaccuracy that I want to address is the exclusion of other important figures. I already mentioned Cato, so I'll make this brief. I don't know if it's just me, but the absence of John Adams was noticeable. He was the subject of a few songs, so just talking about him without having him as a character felt odd to me. I also can't believe I have to say this, but Miranda, you forgot about the indigenous people. You could also mention how slaves and black soldiers were mostly sidelined in the story, but if you want to get more into who was excluded, I recommend you look into The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda by Ishmael Reed. There's no fun singing on this play since it's meant to talk down on Hamilton, but if you get past that, you'll find a decent critique of Hamilton's shortcomings when it comes to the historically underrepresented. So there you have it, folks. A review and rating of Hamilton's historical accuracy, coming out with a score of
8.6.8.
So what do these numbers mean in regular everyday speech? It's good. Aside from the necessary changes to some details and the order of events, the abundance of historical facts proves Lin-Manuel Miranda did his research. In my opinion, Hamilton does an excellent job in balancing the acting, singing, and plot structure with historical facts. I would 100% recommend Hamilton as an introduction to the basic surface level facts about Alexander Hamilton, the American Revolution, and the early Republic. And if you still doubt the musical's impact on learning about the real Hamilton, you should ask yourself why sales of Ron Chernow's biography increased, or why opposition towards removing Hamilton from the $10 bill succeeded. With all this in mind, if Lin-Manuel Miranda or anyone who participated in the making of Hamilton were to see this video, all I want to say is, good job, can't wait for part 2.